I reckon it's probably fair to say that in these predominantly secular times, really winning a Nobel is about as close as it gets to being called to the gods. I mean, we may not know exactly what the scientist has been called for, but we know that this is a very special gift.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. But as we've heard recently, the process of sainthood is kind of different. No miracles.
Well, yours is a certified miracle, because in 1996, as you know, Professor Peter Doherty won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine for his work on immunology, and specifically for his work on how it is that immune cells can identify and protect the body from viruses. And I know this without looking at my notes, because I actually saw Peter on my Husband's Enough Rope program, who explained in detail, involving a toothpick, fruit, and the clincher was a cocktail umbrella. And he explained
Absolutely.
for what you... So we don't need to pursue that any
And
further.
that wasn't my idea. That was Andrew's idea, or the ABC's idea. And a lot of my colleagues, when they saw that, said that's the first time they really understood what I was talking about.
It was splendid. I would refer anyone wanting to know the details of Peter's work to that. But I mean, since then, look, you've written books, you do public lectures, you have laboratories, active laboratories here and in members. But what I'd like to do is start a bit with the world into which you were born, because you are the oldest son of parents, both of whom, though they loved music and books, left school by the time they were 15.
Well, my mother loved music and my father loved books. He was tone deaf, in fact. It was just the way it was. We lived in the outer suburbs of Brisbane in the 1940s and 1950s, which, surprised though people in Melbourne may be, was not the most exciting place on earth to be. And but they cared about education, and so there was always ideas and discussion and so forth going on.
Right. I mean, you described how you went to primary school, and it was a place where by 8th grade, at least, you know, half the boys had gone off to get apprenticeships or work in the local pig slaughterhouse.
Yeah, the Queensland education system had a thing called the scholarship, which was gave you a scholarship to go to secondary school, and about half the class didn't go on beyond that.
Did you always know that wouldn't be your fate?
Yeah, I knew that. Where I'd end up, of course, I had absolutely no idea. Not growing up in a sort of middle-class environment, there wasn't that sort of mentoring. And education, at least higher education, wasn't a big thing in Queensland at that time. There were very few high schools, in fact, and the year I started high school was when they actually broadened it out and started some more.
Is it Indooroopilly?
Indooroopilly High School, I went to the school in the first year that it started. And so there was no one above the school. I mean, it was just a building on the side of a hill with some teachers, no sporting equipment, no library, nothing much, really quite sparse. It's actually turned out to be quite a nice school in the long term. I visited there from time to time, and the kids seem to have a lot of fun.
And is it true you went there on a steam train?
Yeah, we went there on a steam train. There was a railway line that sort of ran east-west. I mean, it's the same line that went west to Goondiwindi, and they ran commuter trains backwards and forwards on that. They had these little tank engines, like the one you can see down at Queenscliff. There's one that runs up and down to Drysdale, I think it is. Yeah. Mm.
It seems like we're so far away, but what is even odder is that you said that in your book, because that among Peter's books, this is a really sweet one, which is about a light history of hot air, which I know about the steam train. But it was also that you didn't study biology because only girls were allowed to study biology?
That's true. I mean...
Why?
Well...
Girls know these things. You're the ones who need to know.
Yeah, well, it was potentially inflammatory. God knows what sort of thoughts might have got into our head if we'd studied biology. So girls were biological, boys were physical. We studied physics and chemistry. And it was harder for girls in girls' schools to actually study those hard sciences. And often they'd go to the boys' school to actually learn them if they wanted to do that.
So, given that you didn't even study the zone for which you later refined into your fame, when did you know? When was the moment you knew that this was you were going to rise beyond this?
Well, I was kind of interested, and I went to the veterinary school, not to the medical school. I didn't go to university to study biology. I think I just wanted to do something that was practical. And went through a kind of religious phase when I was at high school, and I kind of wanted to save the world, and I thought the way to save the world was to improve food production. Of course, if I'd really thought about it seriously, I would have been an agriculturalist, but I went off to the vet school. And also, just before, when we were making those decisions about where you would go, I went along to an open day at the local vet school, and there was a very pretty young lab tech who was, it's midsummer, it was very hot, and she had just a lab coat on and nothing else, and I was 16, and what can be more stupid than a 16-year-old male? And I thought this
particularly uneducated about biology, as you were.
Exactly. I was totally naive about anything, and so I thought that this looked fun.
That is very shallow of you, Peter.
It was very extremely shallow. I've never claimed to be anything other than shallow, though, Jennifer.
Did you dream of running your own country practice?
I sort of thought that I'd do research on farm animals. I had a cousin who was a medical researcher. He's actually Ralph Doherty, who discovered Ross River virus, the thing that's a big problem up north, and actually his youngest daughter is Diana Doherty, the oboist, and he was a fine scientist, and so I knew about what he was doing, but I didn't want to do medicine because apart from him, the only medical doctors we knew were the local docs, and I thought at 16 I really didn't want to be around sick people. Now, of course.
And you did want to be around women in lab coats in summer.
Yeah, well, that's possibly. And, now I realise, of course, a lot of doctors don't want to be around sick people either, but, that's latterly I've found that out.
Did you like animals?
Not especially, no.
How much was, you're saying you came from a pretty working class background. There was not a lot of money. I suppose earning a living was a big factor.
Absolutely, that was a major factor in it. I was also in for an engineering scholarship to go to the university. I could have ended up as an engineer. I did a very bad math paper in my leaving, and I didn't get offered the engineering scholarship, and I got offered the veterinary one. So that was part of the decision too. So it wasn't totally planned.
Was there anyone you were looking at? Apart from the practicalities of earning a living, did you look at people and think that's a really interesting zone that they're in? Or were there inspirational figures, mentoring figures?
I was a very bookish kid. I was reading a hell of a lot, and I got kind of intrigued about biology a bit by reading Aldous Huxley, strangely enough. Huxley's part of the great scientific Huxley family, and he wrote several of his early novels that sort of focused on biology and the biological research, in fact, that was going on in Oxbridge in the 1930s. And, Chrome Yellow and Point Counterpoint in those novels. And so I was a bit intrigued by that. And then when I did get to university and I started to study biology, I thought it was just wonderful, especially zoology. I was just fascinated by it.
Who else were you reading at that time? Because I believe that Hemingway was on the list.
Well, I'd been religious, so I'd been reading the Bible. Now that leaves you pretty confused. And then I was reading Huxley, I was reading Camus, Hemingway, and Jean-Paul Sartre. So I was one of the most confused kids on the planet. You're putting all those things together. Where would you go?
Well, just jumping ahead, it's interesting because after you won the Nobel, I remember someone you worked with, a microbiologist called Pippa, I think it was.
Pippa Marek,
yeah,
yes.
And she said that you were a bit, as a character, she described you as a bit Eeyore-like. Were you a kind of gloomy fellow?
Pippa is a very large and formidable, attractive English woman who went to Cambridge and is very emphatic. I think they woke her up and she was cross, and she made a mistake, and she was thinking of my Welsh colleague who works in Seattle.
So you're not gloomy?
That's her explanation, but I can be a bit Eeyore-like.
Well, I must say, a diet of Hemingway and Sartre at 16, 17, that doesn't sound like a cheery soul.
No, that's probably true. I probably wasn't very cheerful. Yeah.
What happened to the religious experience? It obviously didn't stay with you.
Well, I think just about all of us, my generation, who went through some sort of religious upbringing, we retain those basic values that we got through that. And I think those, we live in a sort of in the main, a post-Christian society, if you like. And I just, you study biology, well, it takes a lot of the mystery away, that's for sure. I mean, it's pretty hard to believe you're going to be rebuilt after you're dead or something, after you've been studying biology and doing post-mortem. So, yeah.
So it did. I mean, in fact, the study of the science, because, there's so many people who say you can, like Charles Birch used to, you can be both. You can be both a true man of science and also a man of faith.
Some people are, but they either rationalise one or the other dramatically, or they divide the two areas of experience quite substantially. And fair enough. I mean, we all have to sort of get through life somehow, and it can be very difficult. And if people do get some satisfaction out of that, well, good luck to them. I don't think, just because we're scientists and we sort of look at the world through evidence and rationality, I don't think we actually have to be anti-joy or anti-hope police. And sometimes science can take on that aspect a little, and it's not that attractive.
Do you know anyone as intolerant as Richard Dawkins?
Well, Richard Dawkins made a case, but Richard Dawkins lives in an Oxbridge College environment, and he made an argument, and it's a very good, no doubt, a very good intellectual argument. But if you live in Middle America, as we did for a quite substantial time, and you go into a small country town, and the life is around the country club and the churches. And that's pretty much it. And the closest anyone comes, they're watching Fox television, so they're getting no intellectual component whatsoever, and they're just being lied to constantly. And so the closest you ever get to sort of an intellectual life might be when you go to church and they do this adult Sunday school. So I think it's very difficult to judge people universally from the sort of aspect where we live. You get into a cab in Melbourne. It's Islamic taxi driver, and he sort of makes a greeting, and you say, "Isn't it a great day?" And he says something to the effect, "Well, that's how God's made it," and that's central to his being. So am I going to criticise his view of the world? I don't think so.
But you didn't pursue it yourself?
No. I'm not naturally cut out for the cloth, I think.
What I do notice in your writing is that you do, though, you refer constantly to literature.
Yeah.
I've read many science books, and not many of them quote from Lane the Butler, or Dr. Manette from Tale of Two Cities. Was this an opportunity for you? Did you think that, in fact, you might have wanted to pursue that life?
Well, fiction. Science is basically, you write very honestly in science, or you try to. But of course, what you write in a scientific paper and so forth is of very limited interest. And it's only a small group of people who can actually read it and comprehend it.
I'm so glad you realise that.
Oh, totally, yeah, totally. And so, but then if you read more broadly, the most honest form of writing, I think, is actually fiction. Because, biography is totally dishonest. Autobiography, very dubious. So fiction...
History?
History, yeah, it depends who writes the history. History's fascinating. I like to read history. I like to read autobiography and biography, but I think fiction is often where you bring things out, and you get, from reading fiction, you sometimes get a different way of looking at things. And I think that's why I find fiction so fascinating.
Do you think that's actually one of the things you've spoken about a lot, and I think, you'd have to be blind not to see, is that science has a communication problem. It's really difficult. Do you think there are good science books, or in fact, good science fictions, or in fact, is that part of the problem? It's precisely because people don't penetrate science with imagination and fictionalise it that people tend to sort of just block it.
Some people like science fiction itself, which can often have a lot of interesting ideas in science fiction. I don't particularly read. There can be interesting ideas. You either like it or you don't, I think. I'm not particularly taken with science fiction. I think it's hard. Scientists themselves, on the whole, are not that interesting. We sit in labs, we work hard, and we get up to the various things that other people get up to, but it's not that interesting. And writing about the actual process of science can be not that interesting. So there are very few scientific novels that are worth reading, in fact. And they're usually they're novels about the politics of science, like old C.P. Snow, perhaps, or it's more the politics of college life, really. About fraud in science. So there's Allegra Goodman's book, Intuition, which is about possible fraud at an MIT lab. And then, there's just not much, unless you go to, say, Dava Sobel, writing about Galileo's daughter and so forth, which is sort of faction, I suppose, semi-fiction. That can be interesting. But
do you think it would help if there was better and more writing about science?
Well, that's what I've been trying to do, write about science, but so far I've sort of stuck with non-fiction. I did try fiction, and it's a totally appalling disaster. I mean, it's very hard.
Oh, do tell.
It's very hard for us. Well, if it ever got published, it would be the first Jane Austen climate change murder mystery, but, I don't think it's going to get there.
Is it because you can write, but you just don't think you're maybe a novelist yet?
I found, I'm a kind of undisciplined writer anyway, because, I'm very disciplined in the way I write science. We have to be. When it comes to writing non-fiction, I'm a bit undisciplined because it's fun and you can go in different directions and there's a lot of non sequiturs, basically. But in fiction, there was no discipline, so it just got wilder and wilder and worse and worse. I knew that I was getting lost.
And where does it live? In the bottom drawer?
In the bottom drawer.
Legendary bottom drawer?
In the legendary bottom drawer. So, number 2 novel is going to be much more structured.
You went from Queensland and actually did your PhD in Edinburgh. Had you started to narrow your focus to immunology then? It was clear that this was the zone you were going to...
No. In fact, my initial interest wasn't in immunity so much. It was in how virus infections work, what actually happens within an individual. And at that stage, I was studying the individual was a sheep, and or a pig or a cow, and I wasn't really focused on doing medical research at all. I mean, I'm the first person with a veterinary training to win a Nobel Prize. I mean, you have to be totally stupid to go to vet school and want to win a Nobel Prize. And that wasn't any sort of consideration. So I was interested in how the infections actually work. I mean, how do they kill us? And we're still actually working that out. There's a lot we don't understand. And then in Edinburgh, what happened was I was working for a government lab in Brisbane, doing some relatively low-level research. And I wanted to go ahead and do a doctorate. And I knew about this place in Edinburgh, and they advertised a job in the science journal Nature. They wanted I was working as a pathologist and a virologist, and they wanted a neuropathologist, a brain pathologist. Very, very specialised stuff. They said, must have 10 years experience and be board certified and everything. So I wrote off and said, I don't know anything about it, and but I'd be happy to come, and I'd like to do a PhD through the university at the same time. And they said, come immediately. So then we went to Scotland on a very slow ship, and I did pathology, and we made some discoveries there, and then I kind of got interested in immunity through that.
So it came then? Yeah.
Well, partly. Also, I had been kind of interested in some of it from reading books by Macfarlane Burnet. Burnet, of course, belongs to a totally different generation of scientists, and he belonged to a generation of science, or a time in science, where you could write rather general books, which are fairly readable to an educated group, a biologically educated group. Nobody writes those kind of books anymore. There's no real demand for them, but I'd read some of his books early on and been fascinated by that.
Well, just before we move on to the Nobel, were your parents just hugely pleased? I mean, you were... Well, these are prodigious achievements for someone who,
to win the Nobel Prize. My father died when I was quite young. He died when I was 21. And actually from the same condition I've got, but I take pills. I mean, a lot of us are alive because of Lipitor and blood pressure pills. My mother was kind of aware, but she was failing a bit at that stage. So, yeah, she was pleased by it, but she didn't come to the ceremony or anything like that. She wasn't up to that sort of thing.
Oh, it's a shame. Okay, so you won it in 1996 for work that you had done at John Curtin.
23 years previously.
23 years, which is, a generation in human terms, but that is eons in scientific terms. Is it normal that it takes that long, the gap?
Yes, it's kind of, In the middle, if you look at the Nobel Prize to Liz Blackburn, the telomerase one from last year, it was about the same time, about 22, 23 years or so.
Why does it take so long?
Well, the Swedes are very conservative and they don't want to get it wrong. In actual fact, the wording of Nobel's will says it should be given for research done in the previous year. That never happens. And basically, way back, they got a couple of things quite wrong. And like worms cause stomach cancer. That was totally wrong. And
there's a Nobel laureate.
There's a Nobel Prize back in the 30s. So they're very, very conservative. And also with the medical prize, there's so many wonderful things happening in medical research over the last 20 or 30 years that it's a tremendously competitive area. So it can take a very long time for something to come to the fore. And they tend to trade off between different areas. I mean, there are wonderful Australian scientists that all of us think should have won Nobel Prizes that haven't, and now probably won't. So.
Well, it's kind of the obvious thing I find curious. There are clearly many brilliant scientists. There are only a limited number of Nobel.
Yes, very
Is
limited.
there something different in kind between that kind of work?
It has to be a breakthrough. It has to be a paradigm shift. It has to be something that changes the way the whole field looks at it.
And then what, is that why you need so long you can't, but they don't judge on the thing, they judge on the effect
it's not just being a wonderful scientist. I mean, if you're a wonderful scientist in Australia, you'll be elected to the Australian Academy of Science, you might get elected to the Royal Society in London, or you may even get elected to the US National Academy of Science. I mean, say Suzanne Cory and Jerry Adams at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute are both triple threats. They've won all those things. But
Triple threats?
A triple threat, yeah. Well, it's actually a Harvard term. If you could do an undergraduate degree, a medical degree, and a PhD at Harvard, you're a triple threat.
Ooh.
Yeah, okay. And they really are pretty obnoxious. But the Nobel Prize is different. And it's not always the person who's the absolute top scientist. It can be someone who makes a really big breakthrough, but it's not someone you would think of as running big research groups and so forth. I mean, Barry Marshall, who won the Nobel Prize with Robin Warren, Robin's a hospital pathologist. They just made a wonderful observation and they made a real breakthrough that Helicobacter is causing stomach cancer and stomach ulcers. And that was a totally new thing.
So that implies that if you do that kind of research and you know that you've made a breakthrough, you've actually shifted your research field, you've changed the world a bit by doing this thing, that you must kind of know the Nobel's going to come down the pike sooner or later.
Not necessarily. And if you think you know that it's going to come down the pike and you don't get it, you can become a very unhappy person. And so you don't think about it. You don't think about it. You put that on the back burner.
Well, for 23 years,
okay.
it's a lot of not thinking.
So, this is, and that's where the Australian personality helps, because I'm brought up in Queensland, working class background, and basically you're brought up with the philosophy, you can't win, mate. Very true if you grow up in Queensland. And, well, not totally true. But, when the year before the Nobel Prize, we won the Lasker Award, which is the big American medical research prize. And half the people who win the Lasker Basic Science Award, which is the one we won. I'm getting confused, my tenses here. But
so many prizes.
It's all right.
A double threat.
Yeah, right. I'm supposed to be writing. But half the people who win that then go on to win a Nobel Prize. So my automatic reaction was, well, half the people who win the Lasker Award don't win the Nobel Prize.
Eeyore.
Eeyore.
She's right.
Totally.
Eeyore, yes.
Yeah, that's totally Eeyore. Yeah, so maybe Pippa was right. Yeah, sure.
So explain how you got the news. What happened? Do they send you a grand letter or?
No. You get a call. What happens is there's a committee they get about 300 nominations, which they solicit. There's a committee that sits on this all year, and they look at every nomination, and they work extremely hard. They'll also seek external advice, very confidentially. They're very confidential, very close. And then on the first Monday in October, they go to an assembly of the medical Nobel Prize, which is the one we won, is awarded, or the candidates are chosen by the Karolinska Institute Medical School in Stockholm. So on the first Monday in October, the committee meets with, I think it's the professors of the Karolinska, or a selection of them. I think there's a total group of about 50 people. And they present the case for the candidates they've chosen, and then if the larger assembly accepts that, then the secretary of the committee calls up the candidates. We got the call at 4 in the morning because we were in Middle America and this is in Stockholm. So they finished their business about 10 or 11 o'clock. They called us, we got the call about 4, and we were told that you have 5 minutes to let your family and so forth know, or whoever you need to know, and then we're going to announce it, and then everything will go crazy because everyone will be trying to call you.
Who'd you call?
We called our 2 sons, and we called the publicity guy for the hospital. And he then took a lot of it on. And for that year, the hospital gave me a minder to sort of look after me, and we were in constant sort of media type situations.
And did the world go a bit mad? It really does go mad.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I'd always wondered how you know it wasn't a fake. I mean, I had some humorous guys in the lab who could fake a Swedish accent. Well, firstly, the guy didn't sound like a fake. I mean, Penny picked up the phone, in fact, and we were, pretty concerned at a call at 4 in the morning because we thought, old relatives in Australia, what's gone wrong? And he says, I'm from the Nobel Foundation, and she said it's for you. So that's where it went. And then within 5 minutes, we're getting calls from Reuters, Sydney Morning Herald, Talkback Radio in Bogota, Colombia, it just went on and on. Eventually we just, the guy at St Jude, the publicity guy, got the phone switched through, and we had people handling it.
So you stayed up all day? Of course.
Yeah.
But, okay, given that you didn't have, you were talking to people without resort to the fruit, the toothpick, and the umbrella, the cocktail umbrella. And when they would say, you understand the nature of media, and they want a quick 15 seconds max grab. What did you say about your T cells?
Oh, well, it wasn't easy. I mean, it's much easier to explain stomach cancer, but, we discovered how half the immune system works, that basically.
That was it?
Yeah, well, a bit more than that.
Because they wouldn't have understood it.
But they often don't. Often people don't understand. But the thing is, it's a media event. I mean, the only time the science reproducibly gets in the media is with the Nobel Prizes, because it's sort of on the media calendar. And then it may get more or less prominence. For instance, the Japanese, I'm told, always turn up to the assembly in Stockholm to hear what the decision is. The minute it's announced that it's not a Japanese, they all pack up and leave. I mean, the minute. And the Australian press wasn't really very interested in our Nobel Prize. I think they sent someone to Oslo for the Peace Prize because it was Ramos Horta and Archbishop Bello.
And we can all understand peace.
Yeah, they understood that, but they didn't. But nobody came to Stockholm except some of the independents. Yeah.
In your book, this is Peter's before this, the beginner's guide to winning the Nobel Prize. You say that actually, in terms of fame, he says it was the equivalent to being the guy in the crowd scene in a coffee commercial on the television.
Well, it depends.
I'm sure it was more important than that.
Yeah, you get awfully famous in a small group of people, a little more famous in a larger group, but probably what gave me a lot more exposure in Australia was being Australian of the Year that following year. And so I was out here a lot. I was out here a lot. We came out 3 or 4 times to do the Australian of the Year thing. This is before the Australian of the Year was a sort of a Miss America contest between people from different states. It was when the candidates were selected by a group of people in a back room somewhere. And so otherwise I would never have been Australian of the Year. But up till then, anyone who won a Nobel Prize was Australian of the Year.
And you became a triple threat yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Lasker Prize, Nobel Prize, and Australian of the Year.
Yeah, I got all that stuff,
Did you? Are you kind of a good politician? The fact that you've had such success with prizes suggests you're quite good at this.
No, I'm a terrible politician, actually. I mean, politics is for politicians. Scientists aren't. Most scientists aren't politicians, and I'm too direct. I'm best kept in the background and so forth.
But you've won prizes, all these prizes.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
couldn't
but
be
you win the
that bad at
prizes.
it.
You win the prizes for the science, not for the politics. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do people, the other Nobel laureates, do do any of them behave a bit like, I don't know if you've read I'm sure many of you have the new Ian McEwan novel, Solar, which has the most repellent character as its chief character,
Totally.
Michael Beard, who is a Nobel laureate who is basically sponging off the system, coasting, resting on his laurels in a very, very resting way. Disgusting man. I wondered, are there any of them like that? You've read the book, I take it.
I don't know them all quite so well. Well, that's what fiction does.
That's a political answer.
Well, that's what fiction does. It lays out Michael Beard, right? I mean, we wouldn't really know him in that detail, would we? I think some of them are still extraordinary. Some of them are extraordinarily impressed with themselves. On the whole, they're a pretty straightforward bunch of people. They're smart, but no smarter than a lot of smart people, so to speak.
How did it change things for you?
Oh, well, it changed things a lot for me, firstly because, it does put you on the public stage, but if I'd stayed in North America as a North American Nobel Prize winner, there's always Americans winning the Nobel Prize, and so it kind of gets, you can back out of it fairly quickly. There are lots of meetings around the world, there are lots of things that want to have some Nobel Prize winners. They're like, it's a sort of a... it's kind of tacky, actually, and you, for a little while you get sucked into those, and then you realise you're just there as some sort of a...
You've been wheeled out.
Yeah, and what's the point? And so there's that element a bit, and then, but with the Australian of the Year thing, I sort of did speak up for science, and I was getting reasonable media attention for a while, and so I thought that was a useful activity because the press was taking a bit of notice. Press are not... The interface between science and the media is very difficult. It's not so bad. It works best in terms of visual media where people have actually visual programs where you can use diagrams and things. Science, the easiest ways to get science across is by sort of cartoons and diagrams and so forth, rather than by words. That can work very effectively, and you can explain very, very difficult ideas very simply by having something visual. It may just be a cartoon. But when it comes to actually talking one-on-one with people from the press, particularly the print media, firstly, you can often find yourself talking to someone who has no scientific background at all, which is fine as long as you're not trying to talk about science. And then it often gets garbled. No matter what the journalist writes, as you know, the sub-editor can take it, they can put a headline on that's inappropriate, they can change the story a little and skew it inappropriately. So it's a very difficult area. Whenever I talk to the press, I always wait with a sense of real horror to see what will actually be in the paper the next day. Yeah.
Look, there's many reasons why that might be.
There's many reasons,
many.
And we don't need to go into all of them.
But one of them, I wonder is, I remember a while ago Paul Kelly, not the singer,
the political writer.
The political writer. And he wrote that book, Age of Anxiety. And it does seem to me, anyway, I'd be interested what you think, that this is very much an anxious age in terms of science. It was one thing to be anxious when the bomb had just gone off, but we are anxious about it used to be GM food, the modified food. Now it's all food. We're just basically, actually, we're anxious about vaccinations. We're anxious about so much involving science.
There's so much, basically there's so much more information out there, and information to some extent is increasingly democratized because of the web. And so there's also an enormous amount of misinformation. And I think we went through a period, maybe after the Second World War and so forth, where people were very confident that scientists were all working for the general good, but it's not necessarily been the case. There's an interesting book that's just out called Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, which actually goes into how a group of very eminent physicists in the US actually decided that the capitalist economic model was much more important than the science, and they sort of did their utmost to discredit people who were working and showing that smoking was dangerous, that acid rain was dangerous, that DDT was dangerous. The same group of people, passive smoking, ozone layer, and now climate change, greenhouse gas. The same sort of group of people working through various institutions. So to some extent there have been scientists getting out there and actively discrediting active scientists, and that
Well,
creates
because
a
they're
lot
in
of
the pay of corporations who want them to.
partly it's conviction. I think some of that is, and some of their descendants are clearly like that, but some of them we're operating from conviction that the most important thing was the capitalist economic model, and if science came up against that, that took a secondary role. And we've seen that a bit with the discussions of climate change, for instance. Oh, if we do something about it, it would be terrible for the developing world, and that sort of thing. So, there are complex motives, and human beings are infinitely complex, as we know.
I mean, you've been in the game a long time. You were 70 just last week. Was it just last week?
Yes.
Congratulations. I wonder if you have seen it become more intense, whether the anxiety, the public resistance and anxiety about science.
Absolutely. I think there's just so much confusion. There's in the vaccination area, for instance, there are, and I'm not saying that people are doing this because they're bad people or anything, but people get convinced of certain things, and they're not necessarily, as a scientist, we're trained to look at evidence. I mean, that's what we do. We make measurements, we do numbers, we look at evidence and so forth. And not everyone's trained like that. I mean, people often come from a very emotional position. If your kid is injected with something, say a vaccine, and then 2 weeks later they come down with something, you tend to blame the vaccination, or you can tend to, and that happens. And then you think that, well, this is a bad thing to do. So,
and also there have been cases in the last, decades anyway, or this story that just came out in America about the Americans testing syphilis by injecting prisoners in Guatemala, deliberately injecting them with syphilis.
Yeah, sure.
So some of the anxiety is justified.
No,
what kind of mad scientists were those?
They were, I think, it was a different time, but it's still terrible. I cannot conceive. There's also the Tuskegee experiment where they left a lot of black people with syphilis untreated and didn't tell them. I mean, these are appalling things. There was a lot of things happening. You can trace back, for instance, there was a lot of talk in the 1920s and 1930s in the scientific community of eugenics, breeding out and all this sort of thing. And it was taken very seriously by a number of serious medical scientists. And of course, the Nazi thing totally discredited all that. And so no one would go in that direction. But I sometimes wonder, and I think there is some evidence, that some of the reason for the resistance to the idea of Darwinian natural selection on the part of Christian fundamentalists goes back to that period, and they're sort of confounding
the eugenics period.
Yeah, natural selection with the idea of social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism, the idea that you manipulate society on that survival of the fittest basis, is appalling. And none of us, I think, who are biologists have any time for it. But it's sometimes taken up, for instance, by the proponents of capitalism, who say the fittest should have the most, and that sort of thing. So it becomes a sort of a really tacky situation. Yeah.
Another contributor to the general sort of estrangement, I think, perhaps, is, and you've written about it, is that just on a fundamental, going right back to school days, fundamental level, I mean, all children are taught a degree of Shakespeare and fundamental basic literacy.
Yes.
Shakespeare's not actually basic, is it? But there is a core curriculum, and it involves quite advanced literary understanding.
Used to teach grammar too.
I recall. Whereas science training stops with once you get H2O and CO2, and that's kind of about it. You don't have to get a competency beyond that.
Yeah, it's. I'm not sure of all the aspects to. I mean, for instance, in my childhood, we learnt pretty much no science at primary school, I think. Now there are wonderful people teaching science. I meet them, science teachers, biology teachers, teaching science in primary school. I think some of it sticks and some of it doesn't. One of the problems is science becomes kind of uncool when they're about 12 or 13 or 14. And the other thing, I think, is a little bit the way our university selection programs have been organised. People have been forced to narrow down sometimes to subjects where they get higher grades. I think there's some issues here, but I'm not really up on it.
It's a big area.
Yeah.
you said, what's the point of the fame? What's the point of it? Well, and as you rightly say, because you can put science before the public, and you've done that, and you've mentioned climate change. Now and you do it saying, I'm no expert here.
Absolutely, yeah, sure.
Dangerous. That's a dangerous thing to do. What made you take the risk?
Well, I think, most senior medical scientists come to a point where they get very concerned about the sort of global environmental situation. That was true of Macfarlane Burnett in his later years. That's true of Frank Fenner. Both in fields that are very like mine, actually, immunity, viruses, and Frank actually has done a lot. He started the Centre for Environmental Resources or whatever it is at the ANU and so forth. So I think all of us, as we get late in our career, we say, where is this going? What are we doing? And that's part of getting older. I mean, you try to say, make some sense of it all, and you're not so focused on your immediate career goals, and you start to look more generally. And I'm sort of trying to, one of the things I do is try and watch what's happening in the climate science area, because, it impacts on everything. So I'm much more competent looking at the biological readouts, what's happening to birds, what's happening to ocean organisms and so forth, than I am actually looking at the physical science data. So when I look at it... But you still do it? I'm trying to keep abreast of it. I think it's there are some good websites to look at and so forth. And I'm trying to get an understanding of what's happening.
One of the hardest things I think to get one's head around is why the intensity of resistance. And as you've written, basically if there's a war breaks out, we know how to react.
Yes.
But this is the boiling frog problem.
Well, it is the boiling frog problem, and then of course we've had a very cool and pleasant time in Australia, in Melbourne. I mean, it's the first, I've been in Melbourne since 2002. I'm told this is the first Melbourne winter we've ever had. We've had since I've been here. And of course it's rained more. I think the rainfall's still a bit below average, but we've had good rain. And, but if you actually look at the US National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration website, and you look at global mean land and ocean temperatures, this year to September ranks with 1998 as the hottest on record, and the previous decade as the hottest on record. So, its problem is looking at it globally. I mean, there's a saying in science, which actually comes from a microbiologist, René Dubos, think globally, act locally. And that's absolutely true of this whole climate change issue. It's a global issue. We have to look at the planet like the man on the moon or a spaceman.
How do you persuade people? Because facts have been presented to them, and if you're distracted by Lindsay Lohan, you're not going to be listening to the facts.
I have to be very careful because I'm easily discredited because it's not in my field. And Tim Flannery does more of it.
He got it in the neck too.
But it's not really his field either.
Exactly.
In fact, nobody's field, because it's a new field, really. It's brought in all sorts of people.
Yes, but when you have people who are in the field, they say, well, look, it's a conspiracy of concerned scientists.
There's the people who are really sort of in the physical science part of it, people like oceanographers, astrophysicists, some of the meteorology community and stuff. The people who are actually doing serious science seem to be in pretty much agreement that something serious is happening. There are a couple of well-qualified science skeptics. There's a man called John Christie in Alabama who's a prominent climate scientist, and people take him seriously, and whenever he puts an argument forward, they look at it seriously. The other one's Richard Linson at MIT, again, a serious scientist, a theoretician. Whatever he's put forward, people look at it very seriously. But they haven't sort of convinced the majority of the community that they don't have to be concerned. And so, there's a degree of trust in science. We can't be across every field. There's no scientist who can look at the whole of science and say, I understand everything. I mean, that's impossible. And it's all very specialized. It gets more and more specialized. So to some extent, we have to take our colleagues on faith, which means we have confidence that they've done the science properly, that they've obeyed the rules of science and they're obeying the rules of evidence.
Were you at all nervous going out there and putting yourself up for criticism, given it isn't your field of expertise?
I don't mind being hammered. If you stick your head up anywhere in a democracy, you're going to get someone wants to kick it. It's a fact of life. So I don't mind that sort of so much. I've got a bit of Irish blood somewhere, so used to that. And so
I do like your theory that you write about in the Beginner's Guide. That it's one of the reasons why we're struggling so hard to get our heads around this and actually act is this evolutionary thing that we just aren't programmed.
We're not programmed
to consider those sort of threats.
We're not programmed to look at long-term consequences, and I think that's part of our makeup. The other thing is, a lot of people see this as deeply threatening to their own self-interest, and there's no doubt about it. And some of the industrial activities and so forth, and we're sort of required, if we're going to take it seriously and we believe something serious is happening here, we have to change a lot of things. I mean, that's just the way it is. But we found enormous amounts of money to counter the effects of these criminals in Wall Street who caused the global financial meltdown. We found enormous amounts of money to counter that, and yet we can't find the money to deal with this issue. There's so much. There's so much in sort of. I'm not an economist. I don't claim to understand it, but there's so much that doesn't make any sense to me. The idea of continuous growth. As a biologist, the only continuous growth I know about is called cancer.
One last thing on climate change. You do realise that the likelihood is that once it's gone too far, and basically, yet again, the scientists will be called upon to fix it. Come and fix this problem.
Part of the problem is that people have got so used to us getting technological solutions, and they think we can solve everything. And it's very apparent. I mean, maybe we'll do better in the future, but it's very apparent we're not solving everything. In my own field, we've been trying enormously hard to get an AIDS vaccine. And I've sat on various committees and so forth now for the last 10 or 15 years. I've worked on it a bit, we got nowhere with it. And it's just enormously difficult. And we may not be able to do it. There's some new things being tried, but we may not be able to do it. Then again, if you look at the A310, A3 whatever it is, Airbus, the big double-decker thing that we fly in now, and it's a wonderful machine. I think what an incredible machine it is. It's just the sophistication, the technology, the engineering. And what does it do? It burns fossil fuels. It's burning the product of compressed algae and stuff that's been laid down 300 million years ago.
So what you're saying, if you've got the genius to invent that, why can't you have the genius to find an alternative?
It just may not be that easy to do. It all gets down to BTUs and calories and all that sort of stuff. And so I think that we're going to solve everything technologically, or we're going to go to Mars and get these rare earth minerals and so forth is not necessarily a very good way to go.
Look, you've said, we'll have a peek in the future before we leave, that the 21st century will be seen as the century of biology. Now, we have neither time nor, I don't know about you, but certainly the brain capacity, in my case, to go too far down that path with you. But I'd like you to nominate one or two areas that you think where life will actually change for us.
Well,
in terms of biology,
there's an enormous revolution in biology which really kind of starts with the Human Genome Project and the sequencing of the whole genome and many genomes, and that allows us to probe what's happening in particular diseases in an extraordinary breadth, and then identify things in that are really important. It also allows us to look at things like the genetic basis of things like cancer. So one of the things that I think will definitely happen is what we call personalised medicine. By knowing our genetic makeup much more closely and by correlating that with susceptibility to various diseases, cancer, other diseases, rheumatoid diseases and so forth, we will have a sort of general genetic prescription of how one might best live. For instance, I've recently heard evidence that for certain people with a particular genetic makeup, smoking increases the chance of developing rheumatoid arthritis by more than 20-fold. Terrible disease. We've just really realised this. And of course, it's not really out there in a big way yet. So I think that individual genetic medicine is
So
will be.
the GP will have your
Maybe not the
printout.
GP, maybe the specialist. Maybe you'll go to the specialist and they'll take a bit of blood or something, send it off to the lab, and there'll be little genetic tests that say, this person should be treated that way and not this way. We're already doing it at St Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis. St Jude started in 1962. It deals with catastrophic disease of kids, principally cancer. They're quite rare diseases. Kids' cancer is quite rare. But what they did, which was very clever, is they kept some of the tumour tissue. And so if you go down to the basement of this place, there's all these big deep freezers, just full of tumour tissue. When the genomic revolution came and we could start to read the genetics of these, we were able to dig all that stuff out. We had the case histories of the kids up into their 40s. And we were able to say, look, this genetic profile works, that treatment doesn't work with this genetic profile, and this is why. And this is what's happening now. People are looking at things like colon cancer and breast cancer.
So it's now. That's what I was going
to...
when does this happen?
It's happening now. So I think we'll have better diagnosis. Maybe we'll have much better drugs, designer drugs for things like cancer, so that when you're treated, we're not just giving a cytotoxic drug that kills all your dividing cells, makes your hair fall out and zaps your immune system. Hopefully we'll be able to get to drugs that actually just target the tumour itself. And we're getting down that road. Problem is, though, a lot of this is very expensive. And, how are we going to be able to roll it out for everybody? How are we going to do it?
And the problem is what happens when no one dies.
Yeah. People, that's an issue, and people, I think, will still die. I think, well, they have to, don't they? I mean, I'm 70, but I think we have to make room. We can't all stick around. I mean, just think of some of the people that you would not want to live forever.
Ooh, let's finish.
That's one of the reasons for writing novels. You can kill people off.
Let's finish with you. I mean, you have said that science is for young folk. You're 70. You're still doing active science.
I'm working. No, to be strictly true, Jennifer, I'm working with some very bright young people who are doing active science. You go through different stages in a scientific career. Science is now done by substantial groups of people. What do I bring to that? Well, I bring a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge that's kind of historical knowledge, which is sometimes useful because the young ones don't know it. But the actual research is done by young guys and girls, particularly girls actually, a lot of young girls in the labs doing the experiments, and it's driven by the 35, 40, 45-year-olds who are sort of thinking in the latest technologies and so forth. So I work with them, and I'm a good writer as far as science goes, so I help them write the papers up, I help them get the grants, and I talk about it insofar as they allow me, and so that's how I stay in science. But nobody in their 70s, in my opinion, and I still haven't seen anyone for which this is true, is really driving a major science program.
So it is true, that sort of stereotype that we have from people like Einstein, who had that miracle year when he was 26. You were what, 32, 33 when you were doing it. So it is true.
Biology is a bit different from physics. I mean, physicists do tend to peak very early, and depending on what sort of physics they're doing, and they may transit into something like say climate science and so forth, where they can make great contributions. We have physicists who sort of done their physics who are now coming across into biology because we need the mathematical and intellectual skills that physicists bring. Physicists are very smart people. They know they're very smart people, actually. And so if there are any physicists in the audience, I salute you. And so are engineers. I think engineers are wonderful. They solve things. But I think biologists, because biology is very, very complex, and because it's all sorts of interacting things, biologists tend to go on a lot longer than physicists. And so we do still bring something to it, even at a reasonably advanced stage. But to think that we actually, the Nobel Prize winning experiments are not done on the whole by people in their 60s. Maybe their 50s, more likely their 40s. Yeah.
Is that a neural pathways issue, that you're so much sharper in your thinking?
I think you are sharper. I think I'm not nearly as smart as I was. And I used to feel my mind was sort of kind of razor. Now I think it's more like a plastic butter knife. It's not as sharp as it was, and I can recognise it in my friends, some of whom were incredibly bright, and I can see now they're just like the rest of us. Maybe they always were, but
Well,
that didn't seem like that.
The good thing, as they used to say about girls with their secretarial, you've got stuff to fall back on, you've got your writing to fall back on. And in fact, you were saying that really the less science you do, the more you think, in fact, you'd rather do writing.
I think scientists, old scientists, one of the worst things is for old scientists to stay on too long. And some of them can't give up. It's a very intense, very focused activity, and sometimes it's very hard to walk away from that, because what else is in this life? They don't normally play. Well, some of them play a lot of golf actually, but it varies. So I think it's important to step back at some stage. We've got rid of retirement ages, but still, I think mostly in science we tend to get people to step down from power. At say 65 or 70 at the latest, and I think one needs to have enough self-knowledge to step away before you become an embarrassment. And of course, I may become an embarrassment in writing, but then I won't get published because I have to deal with publishers, and no one is more fierce than a literary editor, for God's sake. I mean,
they're frightening.
They're scary, yeah.
Well, he has so far done 2 popular books. Both of them will be available outside, and I believe you are prepared to sign them with your Nobel stamp.
I'd almost pay people to buy them. Not quite that.
Until the basically one novel escapes from the bottom drawer or a new novel is written, we're going to have to make do with. There's a chicken book coming out.
Yeah, I'm writing a book on chickens. I've just sent the first draft.
I'm sorry, I cannot spruik that one for you. I can genuinely support these ones. A chicken book, I don't know, but I'm sure it's very...
We can't even mention the title. If you mention the title of a book before it gets published, it's like mentioning the Scottish play to actors on their opening night, isn't it? So we don't want to do the Macbeth thing for the chicken.
Look out for a chicken book by Peter Doherty. And won't you please thank him, Professor Peter Doherty.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John.